Mr. President, the European Parliament, this House, has waited a long time for a pro-European French president like you. My group is glad to have you here. France is a proud country, but you know France can only be strong if Europe is strong. You spoke today about the values of Europe, about our common union of values. And you are right. Secondly, to convince the Europeans it's important that Europe must deliver. Protect our borders, stabilise our euro, fight against terrorism, common defence, fair taxation. The list is long, and you can rely on the EPP as a strong partner on this agenda. Concrete projects and values. This has always been the approach for convincing people about Europe over the last decades. Then, why is Europe today so much under pressure and even in crisis? My answer is, people do not feel involved. The reality is that they see Europe still as an external power, not as their own project. The key question for the future of Europe is who has the power, the people in Europe or some elite groups? To answer this question, we don't have to invent anything new. We simply have to practice what is the essence of Europe, what has been fought for over generations with blood, sweat and tears. We must dare to practice parliamentary democracy in the future. You spoke about democracy. I want to be a little bit more precise. What makes parliamentary democracy such a strong force? It gives people a say and brings them together. When my voice matters, I care, I engage, I belong, and I'm willing to work for a common good. And what is if my voice doesn't count? Then it starts to feel like this is not my Europe. This is visible today everywhere, on newspapers' headlines, on Facebook comments, and on voting turnout. When you lose people, you lose Europe. It is good to knock on the doors of the Europeans and ask for their opinion on Europe. And many members of this European Parliament are doing this on a daily basis, to speak, to convince, to discuss with Europeans. But it makes, at the end, a big difference, and you know this. So simply stand in front of people and ask them of their opinion. Afterwards, you can care or not. Or whether you stand in front of people and ask for their vote. Because then the people have the power. That's why we need parliamentary democracy. And now to be more precise. True democracy does not work just during the meetings of the heads of states and governments. Too often they postpone their decisions. Too often they only look for who is the loser, who is the winner, and about tomorrow's headlines at home. True democracy does not mean decisions are taken behind closed doors. True democracy means more than just a meeting. Jean-Claude Juncker already said this, just a meeting between Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron. The Franco-German axis is important, but it's not Europe. Europe is much, 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 much more. True democracy does not mean denying responsibility. Leaders and national ministers cannot keep blaming and shaming Brussels for their own decisions. And true democracy does not mean dividing us into good and bad Europeans. I respect the will of the voters in every member state, whether it pleases me or not. So, what is true democracy? Mr. President, just take a look around here. The chamber of the European Parliament is the right place to discuss about this. Every citizen is given a voice here. You can find communists, you can find conservatives, Christian Democrats, liberals, Green Social Democrats, and even right-wing extremists. Some people call this the old Europe. I call this the democratic Europe, where people recognise themselves with their concerns and needs, with their different views and with their representatives. The European Parliament is the political landscape of our continent, and we can be proud of this. There is no vote on a president of Europe. There is no European-wide referendum. There is simply only one event where all Europeans together are asked for their opinion on Europe. Political issues in Europe must be in the hand of the voters during the European elections, just as national interest issues are in the hand of the voters during the national elections. And for the same reason, Mr. President, the European Parliament is the only place to elect and to control the European executive bodies, a Commission, or I call it the government of Europe. This is why the people must be given the right to decide who will become the next president of the European Commission. Candidates must stand for elections, must defend their programme, explain to people what they stand for, and finally, they have to look for the support of a majority of this chamber, freely elected member of the European Parliament. This is how the German Bundestag works. This is how the Spanish Cortes works. This is how the Polish Sejm works. It is simply parliamentary democracy in praxis, which gives the power to the people. And let's call a cat a cat. Not a college, but a government. Not a commissioner, but a minister. Not a regulation, but a law. That would make things for people understandable if we would do so, ladies and gentlemen. And those who want to become a commissioner next year should probably run for the EP elections. Let the people decide who the government should send to the Commission next year. Other elements are equally important. A true democracy can only survive if it has common basic convictions. There is no French, German or Croatian way of life. There is only a European way of life. And we can be proud of this fundament. It's unique in the world. A true democracy in Europe also means believing in a vision. Politicians like Kohl, Delors, Mitterrand have made the impossible possible because they followed their European dreams. But again, the key question for true democracy is when this Parliament decides to freeze the negotiation process towards Turkey, then the process has to be really frozen, dear colleagues. When this Parliament is deciding about strengthening the external border, then Frontex officers have to be sent to the external border. And when this Parliament decides to introduce a free interrail passes, then the project has to see the light. So the people of Europe must decide, and we are representatives of the people of Europe, about the future of the European project. If we ignore the European peoples, the people will ignore us, and that is what we are facing sometimes today. So let us rebuild Europe as the most successful form of government ever invented by man, by parliamentary democracy. And I know this idea is not welcomed by everybody, but we have to overcome our trauma. Since 2005, we are discussing more about red lines and not enough about ambitions. The French say no more treaty change, the Germans say no more money, the Central Europeans say no more Brussels. I tell you, my main fear is not another Brexit. My main fear is a frightened Europe, and we will not be able to cope with the next crisis when we go on with this. So let's start now. Ladies and gentlemen, we have today the President of France with us. With his forward-looking approach for Europe, we can achieve a lot. The EPP is ready to work for a democratic Europe with ambitious projects, where the people, finally, are the owner of the European dream and the European future. As a young student, I was very much marked by the history of the Weiße Rose. Young people, students in Munich, the youngest was Sophie Scholl, 22 years old, were arrested by Gestapo in February 1943. They had used flyers to call for resistance against the Nazis. I quote one of their flyers. The imperialist idea of power must be disarmed, whatever side it comes from, for all time. Only with generous cooperation between the peoples of Europe will it be possible to create the ground on which a new construction is possible. Freedom of speech, freedom of confession, protection of the individual citizens from the arbitrariness of violent criminal states. These are the foundations of a new Europe. Munich, 1943, 4 young people were executed for these ideas. This has always motivated me to carry on their dreams, dear friends. This has always motivated me to carry on their dreams, and I am sure they would be proud of what has been achieved during the last decades. A Europe of peace and freedom. And the task of my generation is now to build up a real democratic Europe, that the future is in the hand of the people of this continent, a true parliamentary democracy for Europe. Let us begin. Thank you.